Earlier this week, the Kiribati President Anote Tong announced that despite intentions to purchase land on the Fijian island of Vanuatu, there are no plans to relocate people there. But with Kiribati feeling the effects of rising sea levels, there is plenty of speculation that a resettlement may happen in the future. Scott Leckie is the Director of Displacement Solutions Australia, an organisation that works with displaced people and their rights, and he's joining us on the line. Good morning, Scott.
Good morning.
Tell us first up, Scott, how much is migration in the front of people's minds in Kiribati?
Well, I think, we've worked there quite extensively over the past few years and probably interviewed hundreds of people over the past 2 or 3 years. And what you find there and in Tuvalu and in a number of other countries in the Pacific is that although resettlement and relocation on a large scale is hopefully something very far off in the future, that just about every family that you speak to has already come up with their own little plan should the situation get so bad that resettlement and relocation is necessary. So it's very much of a topical issue on the streets. But I think, and this relates very much to what President Tong noted in the media very recently concerning the land in Fiji. There's great reluctance on behalf of any government to acknowledge the need to resettle at this time, and there's still a lot of room for adaptation and measures to be undertaken domestically to make resettlement something that can be delayed for a very long period of time, perhaps prevented entirely. And that would certainly be the goal and objective of any work in the Pacific region or in any country in the world that's threatened by climate change.
I'm sure it would be. You say that when you speak to families in Kiribati, they all have their own little plans, if you put it that way. Well, what sort of things do those plans include?
Well, excuse me, some are, grandiose plans, of course, perhaps not very realistic, like moving the entire family to, live in Boston in the United States or something of that nature. But most of them are quite realistic. Some have ties to people in other countries. Some already have family members in New Zealand, for instance, or in Fiji, or to a very small extent in Australia. And they plan possibly down the road to carry out family reunification measures with their families. Others have contemplated the idea of moving to places such as Fiji, perhaps en masse, should the situation come to that. And our perspective on that really is, let's see what's possible within Kiribati and all countries affected by climate change domestically, and let's see the extent to which governments can be assisted in being provided with the resources and funds necessary to carry out adaptation that actually can keep people in the country and maintain ongoing development processes. Because our fear is that, and certainly this would be the fear of governments in many countries, that the second you start placing all your eggs in the resettlement basket, the possibilities for carrying out ongoing government programs, basic economic and social development processes, etc., will essentially be stopped in their tracks, and you will essentially create an inevitable situation whereby resettlement occurs even if it's not necessarily required.
So once it starts, there's no going back kind of scenario.
Absolutely, and we need to really, highlight the fact that, that Australia, unfortunately, is per capita the world's number one emitter of CO2 gases, and the United States certainly is recognized as the leading contributor to CO2 in the atmosphere over the past century or two, and a lot of responsibility really falls on the shoulders of those two countries in particular to really provide the resources required to enable people within the island countries to stay in their beloved homes for as long as physically possible. And to date, we have seen virtually no financial assistance in this regard to any of the countries in the Pacific, which would enable people to stay for perhaps many more decades. And that we believe the technology is there, the willingness to carry out the measures required domestically is there. What's lacking is political and particularly financial support from the countries that are really ultimately responsible for rising sea levels.
Tell me, Scott, going back to the resettlement issue, I mean, it's often talked about the sort of economic issues and that sort of thing, but culture and customs, it's so tied into land and where you live. I mean, if people did have to leave Kiribati, this would really be a gut-wrenching thing, wouldn't it?
Absolutely. You can. It's a very difficult concept for people in the Western world to conceive of, but in much of the world where customary land relations are the norm, which is certainly the case in the Pacific, one's personal identity and certainly one's family identity cannot be separated from the land on which they reside and have done for many generations. So you're not simply ripping a person away from a country, but you're basically taking part of them out of themselves by forcing them, against their will, really, to relocate to a foreign land or to another piece of land in the same country. So that is such a central issue to the entire question of resettlement, and once again, one of the reasons why, if at all possible, measures should be taken to enable people to stay within their countries, because that's really what a very large segment of the people would clearly wish to do if it was possible and economically viable. They would certainly choose to stay. And, young people in all countries in the world want to go abroad, overseas, and see what it's like elsewhere and perhaps study elsewhere. And there's nothing unusual about that. So you certainly have those sentiments in Kiribati and other countries. But particularly let's say the middle-aged generation and the older generation certainly feels extremely strong ties to their land and to their country and their islands and their culture, and would really like nothing more than simply to be able to go on living how they're living. And climate change, of course, makes that increasingly difficult.
It does. I think, Scott, for people who maybe haven't visited an atoll country before, like I've been to Kiribati, and I remember as an Australian who's used to wide open spaces, just being gobsmacked really by the fact that you can stand there and you can see the sea on either side of you,
right.
And there's really not much room to move. So I don't know, how do you get the message across to Australians? You're talking about the Australian government policies to do with CO2 emissions and all the rest of it, but what about ordinary Australians to actually make them comprehend and understand? I mean, short of taking people to Kiribati and Tuvalu and other places and showing them the impact.
Well, with all things in the world, trying to stand in someone else's shoes is really the best way to understand what it must be like to live that life. And indeed, we're not going to get all of Australia there, but I mean, you simply need to imagine as an ordinary Australian what it would be like if there was essentially a body of water, that started at where your street starts, and another one that was, just beyond your back fence, and those were slowly but surely rising, and you had essentially nowhere else to go in your neighborhood because there was no higher ground to go to. And there was really nowhere else in your whole country to go to. And that's kind of the dilemma that a lot of these people are facing in both in the capital as well as in the outer islands. There's no place to retreat to. It's not like Bangladesh and a number of other countries which face very different situations, but at least there's some higher ground there. And in Fiji and Vanuatu and Solomon Islands and some of the other areas which are also affected in coastal terms by climate change, there are higher pieces of ground to go to, also in Papua New Guinea with the Carteret Islands. Particularly with Tuvalu and Kiribati, there is no higher ground to go to. So the only real option in terms of being able to stay would be the carrying out of very serious adaptation measures, which essentially involve building seawalls around some of the most heavily populated areas at such a level that they will be protected for possibly centuries to come.
Just finally, Scott, I understand that you've got a team heading back to Kiribati in June. What's the aim of that visit?
Well, we believe that basically people should be able to stay as long as they possibly can, where they would like to stay and where they're from. But we also pragmatically believe, and particularly taking the view that everyone affected by climate change are not just citizens, but they're basically rights holders, and they have the full spectrum of human rights, as well as, in particular, housing, land, and property rights. And we believe that every measure needs to be taken both domestically and internationally to ensure that housing, land, and property rights of climate-displaced people and communities are protected. So there's a need to plan, and there's a need to be prudent about thinking about worst-case scenarios. And so our work will involve, in the coming months, looking in more detail at this new piece of land in Vanuatu that's either under purchase or has been purchased by the government of Kiribati, as well as looking at possible relocation options for people from Tuvalu, should the situation come to that. And that would also involve possible resettlement to an island called Kioa in Fiji, which is already occupied almost exclusively by Tuvaluans. So trying to smooth the process out, trying to instill a sense of rights both in the minds of people affected, and particularly the governments, and hopefully convincing the government of Fiji and people of Fiji that it would be very generous and kind of them to slowly but surely open their doors to their island brothers and sisters across the Pacific who might have really nowhere else to go.
Mm-hmm. Well, as you say, let's hope that doesn't happen for quite some time. Scott Leckie, thanks very much for joining us this morning.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.